When my home became foreign to me, I realized I had lost not only the walls but also myself. It had been my sanctuary, my space, and now its walls were covered with someone else's memories. Every decision I made had to be defended like a desperate warrior. My mother-in-law, Norma, with her calm, destructive authority, had infiltrated every corner of my life, taking not only my material possessions but also control over my very existence. My husband, the one person I had once trusted, had become a shadow of his former self, consumed by family obligations that I couldn't understand. And now I stood at the edge of an abyss, clutching my last attempt to reclaim everything that had once been mine. But as it turned out, playing this game by someone else's rules meant losing everything down to the last grain. I had known this moment would come, but I hadn't anticipated how painful it would be. My name is Vivian, and 3 hours ago, my home was the embodiment of perfection, bright, orderly, with impeccably chosen furniture and decorations, every space thoughtfully arranged down to the smallest detail. I was proud of it. Everything was in its place, each item had its story, every room was filled with an atmosphere of comfort and warmth. But now, it was all gone, like sand slipping through my fingers, leaving behind a strange picture. My mother-in-law had turned my home into something she probably considered an improvement, but for me, it was something else, a violation, an unwelcome intrusion into my life. The furniture had been rearranged without any logic or meaning, as if the pieces that had been placed there initially had no right to exist in this space. My artwork, the paintings I had so carefully chosen and hung on the walls, were now stacked in the corner, as though they didn't deserve a place in this apartment. And on every surface where something could be placed, there were photographs. Family photos I had never seen before. It was like a persistent reminder of a foreign family past, one that she evidently intended to bring into my life with such insistence. "I hope you don't mind," Norma's voice rang out as she entered the room. Her words were delivered with such a carefree tone, as if everything happening was perfectly normal. "Dear Mark gave me his key so I could surprise you both." For a moment, I found it hard to breathe, frozen in place, not knowing how to respond. Norma, undoubtedly trying to show kindness and concern, had, to me, appeared to be acting aggressively. Norma left the room, but not just any ordinary departure. She did it as though she were unaware of my presence, donning an apron over her neatly pressed floral dress. "Poor boy," she said, referring to Mark, "he eats takeout too often," as she passed by me. Her words were like a reproach, subtle but piercing. My fingers clenched into fists, but I tried to stay calm, though a storm was growing inside me. Where was he, Mark? Still at work? Lately, he'd been spending so many hours in the office that I was starting to lose track of the time we spent apart. It was becoming unbearable. Meanwhile, Norma continued to take charge, oblivious to my emotions. She adjusted a recently hung portrait of her late husband, as if trying to subdue this corner, once mine, to her will. "Someone should take care of him properly," she said, and those words hung in the air. I felt them wrapping around me like toxic gas, poisoning everything around. Did she really think I wouldn't take care of my own home, my own husband? These insinuations made me feel strangely absent, as if I had no place here. I pulled out my phone to call Mark, but didn't dial. Instead, I quickly typed a message, "I'll be home soon." Emergency. I hoped he'd see it and understand that something was wrong. But even without knowing what would happen next, I felt the pressure mounting, this fragile world I had gotten used to collapsing before my eyes. Norma's voice echoed upstairs, like an evil echo, her tone suggesting she believed she had every right to control every corner of this home, which had once been my refuge. "I'm just going to move these modern artworks to the garage. They don't quite fit in a family home," she said, as if this were an undeniable fact, not open for discussion. My wedding vase, the very one I had so lovingly kept as a symbol of a new life, lay shattered in the trash, and my art was banished, squeezed out of the space, which was now turning into a place completely alien to me. My space had been erased in pieces, and worst of all, my husband had let it happen. He hadn't said a word, hadn't protested, hadn't even tried to defend me in any way. It was as if he had surrendered, as though his wife and his mother, two forces pulling in opposite directions, did not exist in the same reality. I opened my phone and called Rachel, my friend, the one who always understood, always ready to listen. "Hi," I said when she finally answered, her voice carrying that familiar, comforting tone I so often sought when everything around me was falling apart. "Remember how you used to say I was too good, letting people walk all over me?" I asked, trying to hold back the rising irritation that seemed ready to burst out. "Yeah, I think that's about to change," I continued, watching as Norma carried my favorite sculpture toward the garage. My hand tightened around the phone, and I felt my heart race. "I won't be nice anymore," I whispered to myself, like a promise I had made to myself. My mother-in-law had just declared war on me, and despite still trying to keep my emotions in check, I knew, now I had to fight. Fight for what was mine, for my life, for the home I had built over the years, with love and care. With each passing day, Norma became more and more confident in her right to everything I had, and by now, there was no doubt that she was resolute. 3 days into this endless invasion, I found myself hiding in my office at work, consumed by all this bureaucracy and paperwork that no longer held any meaning. I pretended to be reviewing proposals for marketing materials, but my mind was far from here. I thought about how I could no longer let her dominate, how I would fight for my boundaries, how I would defend my life and the space I had worked so hard to build. And when I looked out the window again, seeing Norma rearranging things yet again, my patience began to wear thin. There was no room left for doubt. I exhaled and straightened up in my chair. Was I ready for this war? I didn't know. But I would no longer allow anyone in my life to destroy what I had built with such love and care. She didn't understand what she had started. And I was going to show her. I lowered my voice, aware of the potential severing of ties, knowing that every word spoken aloud could lead to consequences I was not ready to face. We had talked about starting a family, about how we should do it, but in a situation where your mother controls everything, from the furniture in your house to every movement you make, it becomes impossible. I met his gaze, hoping to find even a shred of remorse or support, but instead, his eyes were empty, like glass, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's temporary," he said, but his words lacked conviction. They carried the same uncertainty I felt in our marriage. He didn't even try to understand that for me, this was not just an invasion of my personal space, but a real threat. "She'll adjust," he said, as if I were the one who should wait for her whims and advances to subside. Norma called him, and I heard her voice from the kitchen, cold and confident. "As always, Mark, the sauce needs stirring." I felt a surge of anger rising within me. He hesitated, caught between us, like an indecisive man at a crossroads, unable to choose a side. I grabbed his hand, feeling how every movement of his became part of a game I no longer wanted to play. "Choose, Mark," I said, my voice carrying a cold determination I didn't expect from myself. "Right now. Are you going to tell her to back off, or am I not making this situation more complicated than it needs to be?" I tried not to sound threatening, but every word was like a jab, pushing him toward a decision. I could no longer wait, could not let this woman destroy what I had built. He pulled away, his face hardening. "She's family," he said with weariness that sounded more like an excuse than true understanding. "And what am I?" His words hung in the air, unanswered, as if I had already become insignificant in the midst of all this drama. He was already heading for the door, not meeting my gaze. "We'll talk later," he said, and in his voice, I heard that to him, all of this was just a minor household inconvenience that could be put off for later. I stood frozen in the hallway, feeling all willpower drained from me. I followed him downstairs, unable to stay in the empty room where this hidden conflict had just unfolded. When we reached the bottom, I barely caught sight of Norma, standing at the stove, trying to appear as helpless as possible while he was still around. Her eyes slid over him like a cat, waiting for the moment to strike the final blow. I held my breath, and only then did I realize she was simply waiting for the moment when Mark would once again be on her side. I moved closer to them, but stopped at the door, faintly listening to their conversation. "I'm worried about her, Mark," Norma said, her voice so full of vulnerability that it almost seemed like she truly cared for him. "All this time, he's been at work, showing no interest in running the household." How will she ever be a good mother? Her words struck me like a physical blow, like a knife piercing straight through my heart. I saw Mark's shoulders tense, how he was on the verge of turning to me, to tell her she was overstepping. But instead, he fell silent. He didn't even try to defend me, didn't say a word in my defense, as if these accusations were true. I moved closer to the stairs, drawn to their voices, full of emotion, in which I could no longer distinguish who was right and who was wrong. Everything sounded like a desperate justification, an attempt to cover up their inner disagreements under a layer of cold politeness and forced phrases. Right, because we can't all be perfect. Norma said again, with such a strange emphasis, as if I was the one who had to explain everything that was happening in this house. Mark, can we? She added with that same false friendliness that made me feel sharp pain spreading through my body, as if those words cut deeper than a simple misunderstanding. Travis spat those words out with contempt, the golden child who got the college fund, while I got lectures on responsibility. He spoke of it like a grievance, an injustice, as if someone's life had been placed on a pedestal while his had been shoved to the bottom. I listened, but every accusation felt alien to me, as if I were not in my own skin but in someone else's body. The golden child, who wasn't taught to appreciate, while others were left in the shadows. You know what's unfair? Travis continued. Coming home and finding out that my room turned into your sewing room, even before Dad's body had turned cold. It felt like a blow to the gut. He spoke of it like an inevitable reality, like a pressing need that couldn't be ignored. I felt goosebumps on my skin, and despite the coldness of the situation, I felt ashamed of my own feelings. He was right, too. Each of us carried our own resentments and struggles, but for some reason, it was hard for me to admit that in the moment. Silence descended, filled with despair. I held my breath, feeling myself being drawn into the strange, alien world. I was an unwelcome guest in my own home, a place that no longer had room for me. Everything had become unfamiliar and incomprehensible. I needed to do something to restore order, to find at least one way to feel like the owner of this space again. A project, a goal, an exit was required. Finally, Norma spoke, her voice hoarse, and her words came out with effort, as if she herself was struggling with what was happening. The house was so empty. She said, as if I should understand what she was feeling. But the emptiness she spoke of was not what I felt. It was not simply an emptiness in relation to things or people. It was an emptiness inside me that she was trying to fill with her presence, without considering my feelings. So, you decided to invade Mark's space? I heard the question, and it carried that same sarcastic tone that had been increasingly creeping into her voice. I stood there, feeling my mind fighting to hold back, not to let loose the avalanche of emotions that had been building up. The chair creaked, scraping against the floor, producing painfully loud sounds. I'm helping them, said Norma, and I felt that the question was not aimed at me but at him. But her words were mocking, as though she believed I wasn't capable of handling things on my own, that I needed someone else's intervention to avoid drowning in my own emotions. Vivian clearly needs guidance, Travis added, and I felt his words pierce me like a cold knife. It was not care, it was the expression of his own dissatisfaction and disdain. Nonsense, Mark interrupted him, but his voice was quiet, distant, as if he didn't know how to insert himself into this conversation. Travis laughed sharply, without any warmth, and his laugh struck me like a slap in the face. You're marking your territory, as always, he said, and in his voice, I heard old grudges, as if he couldn't forgive me for something I didn't even understand. How dare you? His voice became loud and aggressive, and it was hard for me not to respond in kind. But I held back. I could feel everything inside me tightening, but I knew that losing control would make everything worse. I couldn't let this destruction continue. I couldn't let this house, my home, become a battleground for foreign conflicts. What's going on? I asked into the empty silence, but the only response I received was Mark's faint whisper, his voice growing softer until I couldn't distinguish a single word. I pulled out my phone and dialed Rachel's number. A plan had long been brewing in my mind, and, as strange as it sounded, I needed to act quickly. Do you remember that strategy we talked about? I said, feeling my anger and determination merge into one. It's time for Rachel's guest room to become my war room. The process began instantly. I didn't waste time in contemplation. 3 weeks after my exile, the walls of my new headquarters, as I called my little war room, were covered in sticky notes, like battle plans. Each sheet, each word on it, was another small achievement, a tiny victory. I was documenting everything, like an architect of my revenge, like a general organizing my army for battle. My patience was running thin, and every step in this direction mattered. Norma's precious antiques mysteriously disappeared, showing up on online auctions, the perfect way not only to provoke her but to strip her of the valuables she so highly prized. Travis's amplifier, that strange and almost divine toy he was so proud of, suffered a short circuit, and now, every word he spoke, every outrage, grew quieter and quieter. The home's security system would activate randomly, especially at 3 a.m., when we were all asleep. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was my personal response, my answer to the invasion of my home, my life. I sat in my room, watching the results, gripping my phone in my hand when the screen vibrated again. Mark. He wouldn't leave me alone, but I redirected his call to voicemail. Thousands of thoughts were racing through my mind, and I still couldn't understand what he meant to me in this game. No matter what I did, he remained on the sidelines, as though he had disappeared from my world. It was strange, feeling that he was no longer my ally, that his place had been taken by the relentless threat of his mother. "Are you finally going to talk to him?" Rachel asked, entering the room with a cup of coffee in hand. As always, I couldn't help but notice her calmness, which sometimes seemed excessive to me. She was like a wall behind which I could hide, like a fortress that knew no defeat. "Why doesn't he talk to me?" she continued, sitting in the chair next to me. I crossed out another item from the list I had made for myself. Fewer and fewer questions remained unanswered. "Besides, I'm busy planning your next campaign in psychological warfare," I replied, trying to relax a little, but inside, everything was still boiling. The plan was ready, and it had to be carried out. Rachel knew that I never deviated from my goals. This was the beginning of something much bigger than just a confrontation. This was the moment when I took control into my own hands, when I stopped being just a wife and mother, and became the actor on my own stage. Before I could answer my work phone, another one rang, a client's phone. The name on the screen made my heart skip a beat. It was unexpected, and I felt my breath quicken as I remembered him. Rachel grabbed my wrist, her fingers cold and firm like steel rods. She pulled me toward her, forcing me to meet her gaze, which seemed to carry both concern and a certain doubt. "Think carefully about this," she said with a firmness that made me stop. "You pressed that button they pressed first, and you won't be able to turn back time." I pulled away from her, freeing my wrist, feeling how her words wrapped around me like a rope tightening ever more. But that step had already been taken. I had already sent the first email. In its lines lay all my pain, my determination, and all the fury that had built up over these months, maybe even over my whole life. They took my home, my career, my marriage. Now I was taking everything back. And even if the world around me was collapsing, I was ready to face it. My phone exploded with notifications. Mark was calling. Travis sent a message. Norma's number appeared and disappeared like a mirage. I turned off my phone, feeling how the cold, dead fear dissolved into anger. My fingers returned to the laptop keyboard, and I felt how this process became not just an action, but a ritual. The lines of text I typed were like incantations. The lie had to be exposed. The truth, driven out of this house, had to come to the surface. And I was ready to give it free rein. "Did you know Norma was hiding the insurance money from Howard's death, which was supposed to be split between her sons?" I wrote, and in that moment I realized she would respond. Not immediately. But she would respond. Rachel looked at me with an expression I couldn't understand. "This isn't you, Viv," she said with some inner doubt, as though trying to protect me from something that was inevitably going to happen. But I knew it was me. I looked up at her, and something cold and definite settled in my chest, like an icy stone, absorbing all my feelings. Maybe this was me now, this woman, ready to fight for everything. Maybe this is the image they had turned me into. The one who was ready to take everything that rightfully belonged to her. The silence hanging over us seemed absolute. Only a knock at Rachel's door broke it, making us both jump in surprise. I froze, listening as Mark's voice cut through the silence, piercing every cell of my body. Viv. Where is Mark? At work? These words spun in my head like an obsessive thought. Why wasn't he here? Why wasn't he with us, when everything was falling apart, when the house I had once considered mine became a battlefield, and I, its stranded soldier? Norma quickly said, I tried calling, don't. I raised my hand, as if to ward off her words, unwilling to hear them. In that moment, I needed nothing except to get away from them. I walked past, not looking back, and my footsteps grew louder as I crossed the threshold, heading for the house. The smell of smoke, acrid and bitter, intensified, and the closer I got, the stronger it became. My chest grew heavy, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on my lungs, but I kept walking. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, water dripped from the ceiling, and I felt it penetrate the floor, leaving small puddles behind. The wooden floors we had chosen together last year now sank into the water, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from how the boards warped, as though everything we had built was doomed. But it was my office that made me stop. When I entered the room, it became hard to breathe. Everything around me had blackened, burned, and melted. My gaze froze on the wall where my achievements had once hung, the certificates I had earned first in my company, the photographs of my successes, the ad campaigns I had once sold, now reduced to ashes. Everything I had built was gone. The photo of my father at my graduation, the one where he stood with pride before cancer took him, had disappeared too. I could feel the weight of the losses pressing on me with every step, as if with each burning ruin, each charred piece of my life, I was losing another fragment of myself. It's all gone, I heard Travis's voice, but it wasn't comforting. On the contrary, his words felt like mockery. The insurance will cover it. He stood in the doorway, watching me, and all I could feel was complete alienation from him. He didn't see that this wasn't just material destruction. He didn't see what I was losing. I turned to him, looking into his eyes, and felt everything inside me break, as though something important cracked and slipped away. Travis called out to me again, his words drifting by as if I were in another world. It's nothing, he said with a slight irony, as if I were overreacting. I couldn't listen anymore. Mom's right, he continued, and those words struck me like a knife to the heart. You know you're too attached to material things. Click. That was the moment when something inside me snapped, like a tightly wound spring that could no longer bear the pressure. I couldn't take it anymore. Something erupted out. I grabbed the nearest object, a wet book I had found in the wreckage, and without thinking, threw it straight at Travis. His face contorted in surprise, but I didn't care about his reaction. Get out of my house. I yelled, and my voice sounded as though I had finally said everything I had been holding in my heart. Norma appeared in the doorway. I saw her face tense up, her hands clenched into fists. Vivian, enough. Her voice was cold and authoritative, but I didn't care. In that moment, I didn't care who she was to me, or what she would do. In my head, only my own words, my own thoughts, echoed. This house was no longer mine. And if she was going to keep trying to control me, I wasn't going to sit quietly in the corner anymore. My phone lit up, and I grabbed it instantly, without even pausing to think about what I needed to do. It was Rachel. Are you okay? She asked, and though her words were full of concern, they couldn't break through the wall that had already been built between me and the rest of the world. No, I replied, immediately realizing that I could no longer hide my feelings. But, I added to myself, I will be. I said it to convince not just her, but myself. Everything was going to be different, I knew that. I started making lists. Each point felt like another step toward recovery. I took a piece of paper and wrote down what I needed to do. Small steps that would bring me back to myself, to my home, to my life. Time moved relentlessly, and the locksmith arrived at dawn. I watched him from across the street, not wanting to be seen. Watching Mark oversee the lock change in our house was necessary. It was an act I couldn't ignore. Norma circled him like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was hard for me to watch. My hands clenched into fists, as if my very essence was resisting what was happening. Every step, every gesture from these people was taking away what I had once called home. I sat in the car, in the shade of an old tree, at a safe distance, while sipping my bitter cup of coffee. It was just like that, bitter and tasteless, as if my entire life over the past few weeks had become that way. That aftertaste, familiar to the point of pain, bland and heavy, wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the thought that everything that was happening was predictable, but still, it shook me to the core. "You can't do this," Rachel said beside me, noticing how I gripped the cup. "Your name is on the document he just signed. It shouldn't be like this." I nodded, unable to say anything, and within a second, I took a photo with my phone, documenting everything: the locksmith's van, Mark's guilty expression, Norma's triumphant smile. Every shot mattered. I captured it all, even the smallest details that, as I knew, would become evidence for the next steps. My phone vibrated again. It was a message from Travis. "Sorry it turned out this way," he started, as though apologizing for everyone, though his apology was nothing more than an empty gesture. "Mom says it's for the best." I couldn't respond. I simply deleted the message, as though it were unnecessary. And that was exactly how I felt. I couldn't waste another second on empty words. The locksmith finished his work and handed Mark the new keys. No copies for me. No options for my hand in that house. I couldn't even imagine how he could stand there, calmly holding the keys I once thought of as mine. But it wasn't my house anymore. It was the house they had taken from me. And every moment, every step, I would be watching. The security arrived as I was leaving. I heard their footsteps, heard them asking, "Do you want to press charges?" Mark's response was lost in the noise of the elevator as its doors closed, cutting me off from this world, from everything that had been mine. My gaze met the window of his office, and I felt a tightening in my chest. Through the glass, I could see the reflections, him and his mother, who, in turn, didn't notice me. I had lost my home, I couldn't start the career that hung by a thread, and they had taken everything, almost everything I held dear, everything I had built. My body was filled with despair, but there was something else in it, something cold and terrifying: determination. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and dialed a number that was still in my memory. It was in my phone, like some last line of defense. "Hey, Travis," I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. "We need to talk about your mother and that insurance money she's hiding." The day had only just begun, but the air felt thick, like the sky before a storm. Travis met me at a cafe, just 2 blocks from my old house. Inside, it was stuffy, and the first rays of morning barely made it through the window. His hands were trembling as he stirred sugar into his latte. It was so noticeable that I wanted to ask him why he was so nervous. His eyes darted around, as if he expected Norma to materialize anywhere, and he didn't know how to react. I felt a wave of bitterness rise in my chest. He sat across from me, but his gaze seemed to try to escape. "You know she can ruin everything, that you won't be able to do anything if she starts acting," he said finally, his voice full of fear and hidden guilt. I was silent. Everything between us had long since turned into a bitter cocktail of accusations and animosity. Travis couldn't hide his state. He was nervous, trying to gather his thoughts. I looked at him and, unable to bear the silence, said, "Show me." "I know you know more than you're saying." He sighed, took out his phone, and placed it on the table. The screen was filled with photos, bank statements, insurance documents, everything his mother had tried to hide, to manipulate. These were the very funds she had tucked away to win her own war. The money that should have been divided, money she used as a weapon. I leaned in, studying the screen carefully. I scrutinized every number like a riddle, every document like proof that I hadn't lost my mind. These photos, documents, records, they were my pathways, my road to victory. Everything that had been hidden was now exposed. Travis, you've burned everything, I said, not looking up. My words were soft but firm. I didn't expect him to confirm it. But he nodded. Clenching his fist, he added, almost silently. Mom, she did this. All you need is the proof. I couldn't stay quiet anymore, Vivian. It's not just money. It's everything. We have to stop this. You need to know what she did. Travis looked like he could barely believe what he had just revealed. I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And if this was war, I was ready to fight. Norma's composure cracked. I saw it, like I would see a crack in an old mirror, as her calmness began to unravel with nervousness. Travis, his hands still nervously twisting his coffee cup, finally broke through, and I felt the tension in the air suddenly become palpable. He said it with such desperation that I wanted to believe he understood how complicated everything was, how deeply entangled I had become in this web. You would have spent your share on that ridiculous group. You needed a leadership structure, and I needed your wife's hands. Travis had never been one to make harsh statements. And yet, it seemed that there was some reproach in his voice, as if he suddenly understood that everything that was happening wasn't just an accident. It was a plan. Norma, she didn't understand it, didn't see how her world, which she had so carefully built, was beginning to crumble like a house of cards. I could feel that collapse myself. My home, my life, they started shaking, as if struck by an earthquake, and everything I loved and cherished was falling apart. Norma stepped toward Travis, but he pulled back. The gesture was paradoxical in some way. He hadn't expected his mother to be so vulnerable. He didn't want to understand that everything she had done was not for the family, but to control everything. Everything I did was for this family, he said. And I replied, no, you moved between us, between all of us, but not for us. It was as though a black hole had swallowed up the conversation, but Norma didn't let it go without a response. She turned to Travis. You're ungrateful, her words were icy, like the point of a knife, and I saw her face pale. Her voice grew harsh, but now with traces of desperation that couldn't be hidden. Isn't that right? The question hung in the air, squeezing my chest painfully. I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't so much indignation as a deep sense of loss. I said quietly, but firmly, don't make him the villain. Your husband wanted the best for his sons, and you chose power, not departure. I said those words almost not believing they came from me. But they were honest, they were the truth I could no longer hide. Mark, standing by the door, quietly said, Norma. It was barely audible, almost a whisper, but in his voice was such emptiness that I understood. He was no longer on her side. Norma froze. Suddenly, as if all her calmness, all her dignity, disappeared and melted away like snow under spring. What? She asked, looking at him, and her gaze was filled with the fear she had probably hidden from herself for a long time. He raised his eyes and met her gaze. It was a moment when all her strength seemed to collapse. Leave, Mark said quietly but decisively. And in his words was something final, something she could not ignore. This was the end. Leave, she repeated his words, but now they sounded like a scream into emptiness. She took a step back, as if those words had bewildered her, and perhaps even frightened her. She wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready, and I wasn't ready. I stood and watched as they both stood in that silence, not knowing what to do next. Everything that had come before, everything they had tried to build, no longer mattered. I saw them leave. Norma still protesting, her words awkwardly floating through the air, but Travis didn't look back when the door closed behind them. Silence fell, deep and hollow. The air carried the sense that everything that had been was now destroyed. And now, it seemed, all that remained was emptiness. The front door opened, and Mark stood there, as always, in his usual suit, but this time his gaze was different, more tired, more worn, as though in these few days a decade had been added to him. He looked older, as if time had suddenly crashed down on him with all its heavy weight. The movers had finished their work, and I took the letter, folding it carefully as if it were fragile, like glass. The whole scene, this farewell to the house, it didn't seem all that real to me. So much had passed in these weeks. Vivian. Mark began, but I interrupted him, raising my hand. We both know why we're here, I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. He nodded silently, seeing the letter I was holding in my hands. It was the last gift from his father. He had handed it to me himself, and now Mark was reading it. I saw how his face grew darker, how his shoulders dropped lower with each line, as though the letter was so heavy it was pulling him down. He knew about his mother, about her manipulations, about all the games she continued to play. He knew about us too, about what we had become. Once, we had a simple, happy life, and now every look, every gesture became a reminder of how much we had changed. And I couldn't even say when it happened, when Mark and I stopped being the people who once dreamed of a future together. He remained silent, reading the letter, and I could feel his body filling with the weight of memories. But I couldn't stay any longer. I grabbed my last box. Its contents were so significant that I couldn't even bring myself to look at the things that had once been part of our life. My phone vibrated, and I looked at the screen. A message from Travis. He wrote that his mom had finally gone to therapy. Thanks to him, Viv, the message said, and I felt something inside me freeze. I didn't respond right away, turning on music to drown out the wave of pain that rose in my chest. Mark, as always, tried to smooth over the atmosphere. He forced out a light smile. Mom's learning to live of her choice, just like all of us, he said quietly. I stepped past him onto the porch, looking back at our house for the last time. This house, once full of life, laughter, and conversations. Now, the walls stood bare, the furniture gone, and everything felt like it was in a cold, empty waiting room. But there was no emptiness here. Something remained. Not memories, certainly. Not just the past. It was something else. It was lessons. Lessons that I might only now be beginning to understand. Your father was right, I said, and it wasn't easy to say aloud. But in those words was something liberating. We all made our choices. And here's what happened.